barn door was wrong. Hank Drover noticed it before he was 50 yards out. The left hinge had been repaired. The gap that had been letting November into the structure since he left in March had been sealed with new board, and there was a thin line of wood smoke rising from the far side of the roof, where the old flue pipe came through. He stopped his horse on the rise and looked at it for a long moment. He had been gone 8 months. He had left the barn in the state barns, getting to when the person tending them has other things on their mind, which was to say he had left it barely standing. Someone was living in it. He rode down slowly, with the caution of a man who did not know what he was riding toward. If you already feel something for the woman in that barn, stay with me. Please subscribe to this channel right now and drop the name of your city in the comments below. I want to see how far this story travels. Every name means the world. Now come back to that Montana hillside, because when Hank Drover pushes open that barn door, what he finds inside is going to take everything he thought he understood about what a person can build alone and turn it completely over. Her name was Ruth Elmer Voss, and she had been living in the barn for 4 months and 19 days. She had found it in late June at the end of a road that had stopped being a road about 2 miles back and become a suggestion. She had been following that suggestion for 3 days, moving north from the Bitterroot Valley with everything she owned loaded onto a mule named Porter and a handcart she pulled herself, and she had been looking for exactly this: a structure still standing, on land that appeared unoccupied, far enough from any town that no one would come to look. She had not been running from the law. She had not been running from a man, exactly, though a man had been part of it. She had been running from the accumulated verdict of a small Wyoming town that had looked at her entire life and decided before she had done anything to deserve it. She was a large woman, tall and broad and capable in a way the town had never found comfortable, and had expressed its discomfort with the consistency of water finding its level. Too big, too confident, which in that town's accounting was most of the time. The man had been a merchant's son named Alden, who had paid attention to her for 6 months, and then, at the moment it counted, had looked away. She had understood. She had also understood that she was 31 years old, and had been understanding things her whole life to no different result, and that it was time to stop making decisions the town could weigh in on. She had packed what she could carry. She had left in April. She had spent 2 months making her way north, working in exchange for meals and a place to sleep, and in late June she had found the barn. It was in poor condition. The left hinge was failing. 3 boards on the north wall had sprung from their posts and would need resetting before winter. The roof had 2 compromised sections she identified by lying on her back inside and looking at the light coming through. The stall dividers were sound. The loft floor was sound. The flue pipe was intact but unconnected, which was the first thing she addressed, because a flue pipe was the difference between a barn and a shelter. The land deed on the doorframe said the property belonged to one Henry Drover, last filed in 1879. 7 years. The cabin 50 yards away was padlocked, and she did not touch it. The barn was not padlocked, which she took as information about the owner's intentions, and she moved in. She fixed the hinge in the first week. She reset the north wall boards in the second, working alone with a pry bar and a mallet. She connected the flue pipe and built a firebox from salvaged stone at the edge of the property, and by the end of July she had a functional hearth in the east corner that drew cleanly and put real heat into the space. She found the kitchen garden by accident, or what had been a kitchen garden gone entirely to weed and grass, in the second week of July. She cleared it by hand over 4 days. The soil underneath was good, dark and deep, and she planted what she had brought with her in seed packets in her coat pocket: kale, turnips, winter squash, and 2 varieties of bean that her mother had kept and that she had kept after her mother. It was late in the season, but not impossible, and she was not a woman who declined a thing because it was late. She caught fish in the creek. She traded work, a fence line mended, 2 days of harvest labour on a spread 6 miles south, for flour, salt pork, cornmeal, and a sack of dried beans. She baked bread in a Dutch oven over the hearth fire, a sourdough from a culture she had kept since she was 19 in a crock that had survived the entire journey north, wrapped in her second-best shirt. The bread was the first luxury she allowed herself in the barn. The first morning the smell of it filled the repaired space and rose through the loft and reached the far corner where she had made her bed. She lay still for a moment and understood that she was somewhere. Not somewhere permanent, not somewhere that was hers by any right she could name, but somewhere. By the time Hank Drover came back in November, Ruth Voss had been somewhere for 4 months and 19 days, and the barn had become, in that time, the most functional structure on the property. He was not alone. She heard the horses before she saw them. 2 horses, not one, and she came to the barn door and opened it and looked out, and there he was on the rise, stopped, looking at the smoke from her flue pipe the way a man looks at a thing he cannot yet explain. Beside him, on a smaller horse, was a boy of about 9 or 10, sitting straight in the saddle with the watchful quality of a child who had learned to read situations quickly. She stood in the doorway and did not run, because running was a thing she had decided in April she was finished with. He rode down, he came to 20 feet and stopped. He was a large man himself, not heavy, but built along lines that suggested he had spent his life doing things that required the full use of a body. Dark beard, going grey. Eyes the colour of creek water in shadow. He looked at her the way she had looked at the barn roof when she arrived, lying back and finding the light, not with judgment, but with the attempt to understand what he was actually seeing. "That's my barn," he said. "I know it," she said. "You broke in." "The door was unlatched," she said. "I have not touched the cabin. I have not taken anything from the property that wasn't going to waste. I've been here since June." He looked past her into the barn. She let him look. She had nothing to hide in it. The boy had ridden up beside his father and was looking at her with the open assessment of a child who has not yet learned to disguise curiosity as something else. He was thin and had a cough she could hear from 20 feet and eyes that were too bright in the way of a child who had been fighting something for a while. "I can leave," she said. "I'll need 2 days to move my things." Hank Drover was still looking into the barn. "What did you do to the north wall?" he said. "Reset the boards," she said. "They'd sprung from the posts. If they'd gone through winter like that, you'd have lost the whole north face by spring." He got down from his horse. He walked in slowly, the way a man walks into a space he left one way and finds another, the firebox in the east corner mortared with river clay, drawing clean, the loft above it tight and dry, the stall dividers straight, the floor swept and banked with fresh straw. On the shelf she had built from salvaged lumber along the south wall, her crock, her Dutch oven, her 2 tin plates, her books arranged by height, which was a habit and not a system. Through the open loft hatch, the pale winter light came down at a useful angle, and the whole interior had the quality of a place that had been thought about. He stood in the middle of it for a long time. "The hinge," he said. "Sourced the iron from the broken gate on the east fence," she said. The gate itself was gone, just the hardware left. He turned and looked at her. "You do this alone?" "I haven't seen another person since September," she said. "Except a trapper who came through in October and sold me half a side of venison for 2 days of fence work." He was civil. The boy had come in behind his father and was standing just inside the door looking at the shelf along the south wall. His gaze had stopped on the books. "You have Gulliver's Travels," he said. "Not a question." "I do," she said. "We had that," he said. "Pa lost it in the move." She looked at the boy. Then she looked at Hank. The boy had the cough and the two bright eyes and the particular thinness of a child who had been on the road for too long, which had its own look quite apart from ordinary hunger. "How long have you been travelling?" she said to Hank. 6 weeks, he said. "From where?" "Billings," he said. "I had work there." It finished. She looked at the boy again. "He needs to be inside and warm," she said. "The cabin is still padlocked, and I don't know what condition it's in. This barn is warm. You're both welcome to it tonight." Hank Drover looked at her for a moment, this woman who was standing in his barn offering it back to him, and something moved through his expression that she could not fully name, but that she understood was not uncomplicated. "I'm Hank," he said. "Ruth," she said. The boy said, "I'm Thomas." Then he coughed, which resolved the question of where they were sleeping. She had him in the warmest corner of the barn, with every blanket she owned plus the 2 from Hank's saddlebags within 20 minutes, and she had the Dutch oven on the fire with the last of her dried venison and turnips from the garden going into it before Thomas had finished coughing. She moved around the firebox with the economy of a woman in a space she knew by now in the dark, which pot, which shelf, which log to add, and at what angle for an even burn, and Hank sat on the stool rail and watched her with the quality of attention of a man who was recalibrating something. "How bad has the cough been?" she said, not turning from the fire. "A week," he said. "Started after the river crossing. He got wet. Fever? Low, comes and goes." She added a measure of dried sage to the pot, which she had harvested from the far end of the kitchen garden in September and kept in a cloth pouch on the south shelf. It was not medicine. It was what she had, and it would help. "He needs to stay still for a few days," she said, "not travelling. The cold is keeping it manageable, but the movement is working against him." Hank said nothing for a moment. "We were going to push on to Copper Falls." "Not for a few days," she said, "if you want him to arrive well." He was quiet. Then, "You know about sickness. My youngest brother had weak lungs," she said. "I know what it looks like when it's manageable, and what it looks like when it isn't." She turned and looked at him. "This is manageable, if you rest him." Thomas, from his corner, said, "I feel fine," which was the remark of a child who did not want to be the reason they stopped, and which she and Hank both recognized for what it was without needing to say so. "I know you do," she said to him. "Eat something." He ate. She watched the colour in his face while he did. Assessing, Hank watched her assess, saying nothing, which was the right thing to do. After supper, when Thomas had fallen asleep against the blankets with the boneless ease of a very tired child, Hank stayed at the fire. Ruth added a log and sat across from it on her upturned bucket, which was where she sat every evening, and they were quiet together in the way of 2 people who are both accustomed to their own company and have arrived at a provisional arrangement with someone else's. "Where were you going?" he said. "Before you found the barn." "North," she said. "I didn't have a more specific plan than that. What's north?" "More space," she said. "Fewer opinions." He looked at the fire. "Wyoming?" "Wyoming," she said. "Small town. I'd been there my whole life." He did not ask more than that, and she was grateful for it in the way you are grateful for a door someone doesn't open, not because you have something shameful behind it, but because it was your door to open or not, and he had understood that. "The cabin," he said after a while. "I'll need to open it tomorrow and see what state it's in. If it's livable, Thomas and I will move in." "You can." He stopped. "I'm not putting you out in November." She looked at him. "What you've done here," he said. He gestured at the barn, meaning all of it: the firebox, the wall, the hinge, the swept floor, the stacked winter wood along the east side that she had split herself across 3 weeks in September. "You can stay, if you want to. Through winter, at least." She considered this. "I'll keep the barn," she said. "You take the cabin with the boy. I'm set up here and I don't need relocating." He almost smiled. "You're set up in my barn." "I'm aware," she said. "I've been aware since June." This time he did smile, briefly, and it changed his face considerably. The cabin was habitable, cold and stale and in need of work, but sound. Hank and Ruth spent 2 days putting it in order, working in a companionable division of labour that required very little discussion because each of them could read what needed doing and did it. Thomas rested and read Gulliver's Travels in the warm barn and coughed less each day, which Ruth tracked without appearing to, and Hank tracked with careful attention from the cabin door. On the 3rd day, Thomas came to the barn doorway and said, "Can I watch you make bread?" She looked up from the firebox. "You can help make it," she said. He came in and sat on the stool she indicated, and she talked him through the starter, the culture in the crock, how it was fed, what the bubbles meant, why you could not hurry it. And Thomas listened with the focus of a child who had found something that interested him and was not going to miss any of it. When she turned the dough out and showed him how to fold it, he did it with more care than most adults managed on the first attempt. "My mother used to make bread," he said, while his hands worked. "I know," she said, which she did not know, but which she knew was true. "She had a crock like yours," he said, "but hers was blue. What happened to it?" "Pa couldn't look at it," he said, "so we left it." She let that be there without covering it over. She let him keep folding. After a while, the dough was ready, and she covered it and they waited, and Thomas asked about the north wall repair, which she explained in full, and about the firebox mortar, and it became clear over the afternoon that Thomas Drover was a child who wanted to understand how things were built and had not found anyone who explained it to him straight. Hank appeared in the barn doorway at 4 o'clock and found his son on a stool helping shape loaves with the expression of someone performing skilled work. He stood there and watched without a sound. Ruth was aware of him without looking up, the way you are aware of warmth from a direction, and she continued shaping and Thomas continued helping. And the smell of the bread on the fire went past Hank in the doorway and out into the cold afternoon. A man named Pritchard rode up to the property on the 2nd week of December. He was the land agent for the Copper Falls Territorial Office, and he had a document that had been filed the previous spring by a party whose name he was not at liberty to disclose, contesting the lapse of the deed on the Drover property on the grounds that the original claim had not been renewed within the 7-year window required under the revised territorial statutes of 1882. The property, the document stated, would revert to open claim at the first of the year unless the current holder could demonstrate continuous, active use. He delivered this to Hank at the cabin door with the manner of a man performing a procedure. After Pritchard left, Hank stood in the doorway with the document in his hand, and Ruth came up from the barn and read it where she stood. She read it twice. "Continuous active use," she said. "I was in Billings from March to November," Hank said. 8 months. "I wasn't," she said. He looked at her. "I have been in continuous, active, and demonstrable use of this property since June," she said. "The firebox, the north wall repair, the kitchen garden, the winter wood pile, the hinge." She paused. "I have a record of every trade and exchange I made off this property from July through October. Dates and parties. I kept it in the ledger on the south shelf because I keep records." He was very still. You kept records. I keep records, she said. I have since I was 16. It was my father's habit, and it became mine. Ruth, he said. The document requires a response within 30 days, she said. The land agent's office is in Copper Falls, which is 14 miles. If you want to go Monday, the road will be passable, and I can stay with Thomas. He looked at her for a long moment. Looked at the barn behind her, the sealed wall, the rising smoke from the straight flue, the stacked wood under the eave. Looked at her face, which was steady in the way her face was always steady, and which he had been learning to read over the past 3 weeks the way you learn to read land, by paying attention over time, not by asking it to explain itself. He said, "Come to Copper Falls with me." She said, "Thomas needs someone here." "Thomas is well," he said. "Thomas has been well for a week and a half." He paused. "I want you there." Copper Falls on a Monday in December was cold and full of people who had somewhere to be. Ruth Voss came into it on horseback beside Hank Drover, large and unhurried, wearing her good coat, and the town looked at her the way towns look at something that does not match the picture they had prepared. She rode through it at pace and did not adjust herself for it. The land agent's office was above the assay house on the main street. The agent behind the desk was a young man who had not expected his Monday morning to contain anything complicated, and he looked at the two people sitting across from him and at the ledger Ruth set on the desk, and revised that expectation quickly. The ledger contained 6 months of entries. Dates of work performed, materials sourced and from where. Trade agreements with 3 named parties in the valley, all verifiable. The repair of a structure of enumerated condition on a named property. She had written it in a clear, unhurried hand that suggested a person who did not expect to have to prove anything but kept the record regardless, which was the most credible thing a record could suggest. The agent read it for a long time. The contesting party, he said carefully, is going to argue that occupancy by a non-title holder doesn't satisfy the continuous use requirement. The statute says continuous active use of the property, Ruth said. It does not specify by whom, it specifies use. She set one finger on the relevant line of the document, which she had read 3 times, and committed to the portion that mattered. The barn was repaired, the garden was kept, and the property was maintained from June of this year through the present. That is use. The agent looked at the ledger again. Then he looked at Hank. Hank said what she said. The agent made a notation. He told them the contesting claim would be reviewed, that the counter-documentation was sufficient to require a formal hearing, and that in his experience, which he offered not as a legal opinion, but as an observation, a ledger of this quality tended to settle questions before they reached a hearing. They walked out into the Copper Falls street. The land agent appeared in the doorway behind them. "Ma'am," he said. Ruth turned. "Who taught you to keep books like that?" "My father," she said. He nodded slowly, with the expression of a man making a note about something. "He did well," he said, and went back inside. On the street, 3 people had watched this exchange. A woman from the dry goods store across the way, 2 men near the feed merchant. They had the posture of people who had come out on some pretext and stayed for the actual reason. Hank looked at her. Something in his face had the quality it had had when he first walked into the repaired barn. The recalibration, the finding of the light through the roof, but settled now into something that was not surprise, because surprise required not having known, and he had known for a while. "Ruth," he said. She waited. "I'd like you to stay," he said. "Not through the winter. Past it." He said it the way he said the things that cost him, straight through the middle, without approach or retreat. "I know you came north for space and fewer opinions. I am not an opinion. I am a man asking." She looked at him in the cold December street, with the mountains above the town going white all the way to the ridge, and she thought about the barn in June, the fallen hinge, the sprung boards, the cold flue pipe, the overgrown garden, and she thought about what she had made of it, alone, without permission, for no reason except that she was a woman who made things and a space needed making. She had done it for herself. She had never once done it for him. And it had brought her here anyway. "I'll stay," she said. They were married in March of 1887, when the road to Copper Falls was passable again, by a minister who had heard about the barn and the ledger and the land claim and wanted to meet her. He was not disappointed. Thomas stood beside his father and did not drop the ring, which he had been quietly practicing for a week. He had grown 2 inches since November, and the cough was entirely gone. He had also, by this point, learned to make bread, the full process, start to finish, feeding the starter and reading the bubbles, and knowing by the feel of the dough when it was ready. And on the morning of the wedding he made the loaves himself, without being asked, and set them on the barn shelf to prove while they were at the church. When they came back, the barn smelled of bread, which was the smell Ruth associated now not with survival, though it had been that in June, but with being somewhere that was hers. It was hers. The deed that spring carried both their names, which Hank had seen to without prompting, and which Ruth had not asked for and did not make smaller by calling it unexpected. She had known, by then, the manner of man who did things without prompting, and she had stopped being surprised by him in the way you stop being surprised by a thing that has simply become true. She had come north looking for more space and fewer opinions. She had found a barn with a broken hinge and a flue pipe going nowhere, and she had made something of both. The space she had not just found but built, with a pry bar and river clay and 6 months of mornings, was entirely, stubbornly, and at last completely hers.